This is going to be a critically important and busy week for the president as North Korea continues to provoke. The president putting in calls to the leaders of South Korea, Japan, and China. On Wednesday, he will travel to Europe for the G20 summit. He will also have a face-to-face meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. John, Allison?
Suzanne, thank you very much for all of that background. Let's discuss it all with our panel. We want to bring in David Drucker, CNN political analyst and senior congressional correspondent for the Washington Examiner, Jeff Mason, White House correspondent for Reuters and the president of the White House Correspondents Association, and Karun Demirjian, congressional reporter for the Washington Post. Great to see all of you. David Drucker, let's talk about what the president's doing here with retweeting things like this and continuing and seemingly even escalating his battle with the media. I read that you said that he believes that fighting with the press furthers his political agenda. How is that going? Is that working?
Well, his legislative agenda and his political agenda should be the same, but I think they're two different things. And I think from the president's point of view, these are the kinds of attacks that worked for him to establish himself as a Republican leader. We often talk, Allison, about how attacking the media, trying to undermine the media, furthers his connection to his very loyal base and keeps them immune from criticism of the president, because if you can't trust the coverage, then there's never any reason to doubt. But
right, but David, I just want to ask you about the math there. So let's give him 35%. Okay, that's what the approval rating, the base is right now. So can he move forward and get things done with just 35% of the country if 65% of the country doesn't like this?
Well, no, he can't. But what I was getting to was the fact that there's a broader Republican universe out there that, although they are not always pleased with the president's behavior and method of attack, believes that he's right about us, believes that he's right about the press. And I think that in a way, this helps him maintain sort of his connection and his support among the broader Republican electorate who, although they wish he might go about these attacks in a different way, tend to agree with him that the media is out to get him. And then they too then doubt a lot of the critical coverage that I think actually, as I've been a part of this coverage from time to time, has actually been pretty fair and pretty on point, even though many Republican voters don't think so. And so I think that satisfies the president's political agenda in terms of his 2020 reelection. And his legislative agenda is another matter. I actually think he could be using his support among Republicans in the bully pulpit to further that if he did things differently, but the president obviously has a different view.
And we'll get to that in a second, because he's using the bully pulpit almost exclusively to talk about the media, not to talk about healthcare, not to talk about Russia, not to talk about Syria. You know, this is what he's chosen to talk about. But Jeff Mason, again, you're the president of the White House Correspondents Association, so you're sort of on the front lines of this discussion. There are people who look at what the president's doing here, saying what he's doing is trying to create a situation where there is no truth. Correct? You know, if you create a situation where there is no truth, there are no facts in play, then you can operate almost with impunity.
Well, it's an interesting theory. I don't know if that's his intention with his tweets against the media. I think that there is an actual deep-seated dislike with President Trump and with many of his advisors at the White House for the media, and that this is just his way of getting back at it. And yes, it's distracting, no doubt, from his legislative agenda. I think it was interesting to see last week some Republican lawmakers from his own party criticizing him for doing that with regard to the attacks on MSNBC. But, you know, whether or not that's a broad strategy more theoretically, or whether it's just really who President Trump is, I think is a different question.
Karun, I'm just not ready to give up yet on the spirit that everyone in Congress espoused after the Steve Scalise shooting. And everybody told us on our air, I mean, it seemed really genuine and really heartfelt. We've got to tone it down. The rhetoric's gotten too hot. It's gotten too hateful. It's gotten too offensive. You're in the halls of Congress all the time. How is this tweet helpful?
It's not. To the credit of the members of Congress who are coming out and condemning it, that shows you the disconnect between the members of Congress after that tragic event and the president, who spoke about wanting to improve the discourse, but then didn't really sustain that very well for more than a few, maybe a day, maybe if even a day at that point. You know, I just wanted to go back to a point that you made before, though, about, you know, there being no truth here and facts not mattering. I mean, that's certainly been a feature that we've discussed about the Trump operation since his campaign days with the question about alternative facts, but it's also a feature of, more strongmen world leaders than the American political system has normally been used to, because we have so many checks and balances here. But that sort of full control over the message, full control over what people think truth is and isn't, is a classic feature of people in control of countries like Russia and places like that. It's part of just, solidifying your brand, solidifying your support and your base, and hoping that extends beyond that as you become more influential. And in this point too, it's controlling the conversation. We're not talking about the health care bill. We're not even talking about, as you just raised, that the discourse in Washington, D.C. in a way that it extends outside the president's Twitter account. So he is the center of the conversation.
And look, Ben Sasse, Republican senator from Nebraska, said one of the things the president seems to be doing here is to weaponize distrust. I mean, what's happening here is something at a deeper level. The president says this is part of the new media strategy, sort of the modern reality here. Let me read you. He says, "My use of social media is not presidential, it's modern day presidential. Make America great again." Jeff Mason, one of the things that people note about, if the media doesn't like what the president's doing here, stop covering him the same way. You're the president of the White House Correspondents Association. If the White House won't hold on-camera briefings, stop going. If the president's going to do this, stop covering it. What's the right way to handle it?
Well, I guess from the perspective of the White House Correspondents Association, we're going to continue to push for what journalists need. And journalists need the ability to do their jobs, and that includes being able to ask questions of the press secretary, of his deputy, and of other senior officials, and of the president himself. So that is important, whether you're a television journalist or a print journalist or a radio journalist. Those are just values that are critical to us to be able to do our jobs and that are protected by the First Amendment. In terms of how specifically individual news organizations and individual reporters choose to cover the news, that's not the job of the White House Correspondents Association to tell. But we absolutely support the right of them to do those jobs, and we'll continue advocating with the White House for that ability.
Karun, I want to go to you, not to shortchange David Drucker, but because I know that you have all sorts of new reporting on where we are with the health care plan that is coming out of the Senate. What's the latest? Well,
the latest is that it is in a period of being rediscussed. They did not have the votes to be able to do things on the schedule that Mitch McConnell put out, which was hoping for the end of last week before they went on this break. Now they're talking about trying to make changes to make the Medicaid cuts less severe, to try to keep the to make sure that fewer people fall off of their health insurance, to try to address funding for opioid abuse and addiction. And so all of these things are still under discussion. We don't know what the final package is going to look like. At the same time, now you have the president's surrogate saying, well, he's working the phones to try to build support, but support to a bill that's not really finalized. You have more Republicans speaking freely about, you know what, if this isn't going to work, maybe in the next week after we get back, maybe we try doing a repeal first and then replacing it. You have the moderate Republicans now saying, you know what, maybe we should go back to the Cassidy-Collins bill and other proposals that were out there that don't look like what the Senate bill looks like now. So you basically have a whole bunch of stuff flying around in the air. They have to nail it down by the time we get back to D.C. next week, in a week's time, or there's just going to be more chaos, and more chaos leads to more splintering, and more splintering leads to not having 50 votes to pass that bill.
So more chaos. Along these lines, David Drucker, going back to your original point here about whether or not the president is using his bully pulpit in a way to advance the legislative agenda here, are his comments on Twitter, are they helping push forward health care, which is supposed to be one of his signature items?
Correct, and this is where Republicans have been very critical. I was speaking to them last week, Republicans on Capitol Hill, and they were telling me that, look, the president has a unique connection to his loyal base, and he can get attention in ways that other presidents couldn't. And if he used the bully pulpit to further the health care agenda, he might be able to actually create votes for this health care bill, and either through pressure or through creating political space for some of these Republicans to take a risk on this bill. And this is one area, and it's why I've always felt they were going to get to a bill one way or the other. We'll see if that happens. But this is one area where if Trump cannot make this happen, this does become a problem for Republicans in 2018, because this would be a major failed promise, number one, that Republicans and the president promised on, and they control, obviously, all levers of government. But the other thing we're dealing with now is problems with the healthcare system. And regardless of who Republicans or Democrats want to blame, it's a problem, and Republicans are in control, and voters are going to expect them to fix it. And so this is something that the president will be blamed for if it doesn't get done. And it would behoove him and obviously his party to get this thing done. And if he could use his powers of attention, if you will,
right,
to further the health care bill rather than attacking the media, his party and his agenda would be in a much better place, especially with tax reform upcoming.
Panel, thank you very much for all of those insights.